Good evening and good afternoon, everyone. Those of us who are here in the hallowed homes reading room, nice and cozy for everyone. And for those who are online, welcome. How many do we have online at the moment? I'm sure it's going to be growing.
Yeah, we've got a dozen.
A dozen online. Well, everyone should know that this is being recorded, and those who are online, those who have questions, just text them, and Erich, our executive director, will be handling all of those. But regardless of where you are listening from or hearing from, welcome again, and it's nice to have all of you here, no matter how you got here. I am Bill McIntosh. I'm a member of the board of trustees here at the library. I am delighted to be introducing Sylvia Torti. The much abused phrase, "who needs no introduction," I think is probably particularly appropriate for this accomplished academician, author, biologist, and in her spare time, president of College of the Atlantic. So that may be taking more of her time of it anyway. You were all in attendance because you know exactly who she is. So I will keep my remarks very, very short. The heading for tonight's address is Science and Fiction Abroad. And I want to disavow anyone that this is about science fiction. It is not. It is about the real thing. But science does play a great part. I just finished reading her first novel, The Scorpion's Tail, which takes place in Mexico. Welcome, everyone. And let me assure you that science does indeed play a large role. It's ecology, it's entomology, it's, you name it, several of the scientific disciplines that come into play. And I'm not sure that this first work is complete fiction. I think maybe she will disavow that as well. But Sylvia's travels, and they have been extensive: Brazil, Peru, Trinidad and Tobago, Democratic Republic of Congo, among other places.
Yes.
And those, I think, have driven her analyses about science, about all of the things that make her novels and her regular research so important. And she is obviously more than a novelist, as you may know. She does extensive research papers and certainly very celebrated opinion pieces about things that happen in this world. The last component, I think, is that her research and her artist residences, her sentiments, and her experiences about bringing man and nature together. So without further ado, Sylvia.
Thank you so much, Bill. Is that the mic's on? Everyone can hear it? Great. I am just so thrilled to be with you tonight and for this really generous invitation to share a little bit about my life journey and trajectory from early days until how I kind of got here, actually, to becoming a fiction writer and how I ended up here on MDI. So without further ado, I'll just sort of launch in to this talk. But thank you so much for the invitation, for the warm welcome to MDI, to this wonderful community that I've received in the last 18 months since I've been here. This quote, which is from Wade Davis, which is, "Columbia taught me that it was possible to fling oneself upon the benevolence of the world and emerge not only unscathed, but transformed." And Wade Davis is an anthropologist, Canadian, and this particular book, Light at the Edge of the World, covers 5 or 6 different indigenous groups of people in different parts of the world. And he talks a lot about their cultures and their language. And he coins this term ethnosphere to talk about the ethnic diversity that our world contains in addition to any biological diversity. I put it up here for 2 reasons. The first is the quote really resonates with me. In retrospect, I also flung myself onto the world and I emerged quite transformed. I can't say that I was unscathed, and I'll share a little bit of that story in a moment. But second, I share with Davis this interest in how we as humans understand and interact with the rest of the living world. And what I'm talking about, of course, is the framework of human ecology, our way at College of the Atlantic of looking at and asking questions about people and about the world and how we affect one another and our surroundings. I'm an ecologist and I'm a writer, and I think I've always been those things from the time I was a child running up around my grandmother's farm in northeastern Ohio before I even knew that there was something called ecology. So those two descriptors, ecologist and writer, sum up a lot of who I am and how I approach the world. An approach that I think is really productive because both writing in ecology or science more specifically or more broadly, both ask you to pay close attention to the world. They make you look at details. They ask you to find patterns, and then using your imagination, you try to understand alternative existences. And I found that writing in ecology can help me understand things at a small scale, but also force me to look at things at multiple scales. And writing ecology are both two forms of storytelling, quite different forms, but still storytelling, which I think is central to our human nature. So back when I left the farm in Ohio and I started college, also in the Midwest, I was 100% sure that I was going to medical school. No question about it. It had been my idea since I was 12 and I was going there. But the first class I had to take was something called ecological biology. And during those 10 weeks, something extraordinary happened to me. I fell in love. I fell in love with leafcutter ants on a course in Costa Rica as well after that first course. And here were these small tropical creatures that venture out along ant-created trails, and they climb up these massive trees, and the ants with their mandibles chunk off pieces of leaves that they then carry on their backs back to the nest. And they masticate these and they use the leaves to create a garden that grows fungal bodies. So they're growing a fungus, and they in turn give this fungus to their larvae. And I was just like, that is the coolest thing ever. I also learned that these ants have predators, these tiny little parasitoid flies that come in and land on the leaf that's being carried by the ant. So tiny little flies. And if a fly ends up landing there, they back themselves up to the area right behind the ant's head where the two sclerotic plates don't quite come together, and there's a little hole. And the fly will lay an egg right into the brain of the ant. And the egg hatches, and the larva grows by eating the mandibular muscles, which are the biggest muscles in an ant's head, an ant's body in that fact. And in the end, the ant's head falls off. They're called ant decapitating flies, and it is quite gruesome for the ant. But the flies don't always succeed, because it turns out that in the nest, there are many different sizes of sister ants. And some of them are these minima ants that end up patrolling. So they'll climb on to the leaves being carried by their sisters, and they'll patrol back and forth. And when these minima ants are on top, the forward flies can't land. So they're really acting as a patrol. And as I was researching this in college, I just was blown away, because the minimas aren't always out on the trails doing their patrolling work. They actually get pheromones. So when there's a forward fly on the trail zipping around, the ants that are carrying the leaves set off a pheromone or a scent, and that pheromone gets back to the colony, and it's the big alarm bell to send out the little minima workers, and they come out and climb on the leaves. And this just, I mean, come on, med school, done. no interest after that. But the fact that there were these theories and models and methods to explore and explain life on the planet, that's really what just blew my mind, the idea of evolution. And it was actually on this one trip in Costa Rica. We were in the cloud forest in Monteverde. It was the rainy season. And there was this moment when I was stuck. I mean, I was literally stuck in the mud in these knee-high boots, and I pulled my foot out and the boot stayed in the soil or in the mud. And there were these hummingbirds zipping around me and butterflies. And I just was overcome with this enormous joy, and I started laughing. And I felt this sense of, I think, in retrospect, a kind of transcendence. And it was there and then that I decided I was going to be a tropical biologist. And it was that simple. And that's then where I set my sights. So I applied to graduate school. And I ended up being accepted at the University of Utah, which in those days had a group of really renowned tropical biologists. These are the two folks who were my PhD advisors, Dr. Lissy Coley and her husband, Dr. Tom Kursar. And I was fortunate enough to be accepted into their lab and to start working with them. And when I got to graduate school, I really didn't know a lot about graduate school or how to even be a graduate student. But I knew a couple things. I wanted to be in the tropics because I wanted to be back in that cloud forest again. And I wanted to study ecology in a way that was connected to communities. I didn't want to study ecology as something separate from humans. So the first project that I thought about and worked on, these came from my PhD advisor. She said, well, I have a friend who's doing some work in Chiapas, Mexico, and why don't you go down and check that out? So the idea was to work on a project that the Smithsonian Institution, one of their researchers, was working on in Chiapas, Mexico, and they were looking at coffee plantations. And there had been an advent in the 80s of companies coming in with a particular variety of coffee that was sun coffee. It grew very well in the sun. It was a very highly productive variety of coffee, but required a lot of inputs of fertilizers and herbicides. And he was comparing the birds that used these sun coffee plantations to the more traditional shade coffee that the indigenous folks were growing their coffee in, and had noticed that there were many fewer birds in the sun coffee plantations, and was studying, of course, then the implications of a large landscape change to migratory bird populations, because of course, many of the birds that we summer with here winter in places like Chiapas. So he was interested in expanding this project, and I flew down to Ocosingo Valley in Chiapas on December 31st, 1993. I arrived, and historically, you know, Chiapas is a place that's known for its Mayan culture, not only in the past, but today as well. It has a very rich history. This is a photo of Palenque, a city-state that dates back to 100 to 800 BC. Things flourished there in the 7th century under Pacal, I should say, who was king for 68 years. And I'm sure you all know the Mayans were incredibly sophisticated, known for their technological expertise in agriculture, in astronomy, and mathematics, and used, of course, corn, which had been domesticated some 7,000 years before that. So, as I said, I arrived on December 31st and connected with a team of biologists. There was the American from the Smithsonian. There was another American entomologist there who was a postdoctoral fellow. There were 2 Mexican biologists and a Venezuelan biologist. And we went to sleep, and we, you know, threw the sleeping bags on the floor in this little hut house, and got up the next morning at 4:30 to go out and do our first bird survey, and woke up in the middle of a civil war. Since it was January 1st, 1994, some of you will remember, unlike the students I teach today, who for 1994 is the same as me saying 1894. We were stopped by a group saying, you know, you can't go forward. You know, we have taken over this area, you know, go back to your houses. We are the Zapatista Liberation Army. And we just turned around and went back to the house we were staying at. Immediately turned on the shortwave radio. It was being reported on the BBC, was being reported on Air France. Within 12 hours being reported on NPR. There was nothing being reported in Mexico at all. So we were in the middle of this civil war, not really knowing how the Mexican government, or even what people in Mexico, even if they even knew about it in Mexico City. But yet it was known about across the world. 2 days later, the Mexican military did arrive, and that was, you know, as you can imagine, they weren't soft. They weren't soft power in any way. They literally just started rounding up anyone indigenous, and ended up killing a number of people. And they were really kind of stupid too. They thought we were involved in this, and so they took us. They held us for a while. They checked out our, you know, passports and things. They wouldn't let us leave, essentially. So we were kind of stuck there. I was able to get to a phone and sort of send a message out, which was really my poor mother. Because she knew I was there, but somebody told her I wasn't on the list of the dead, which of course there was no list of the dead. Anyway, I was 23. It was harrowing. It was traumatic. And we were only able to leave 5 days later when the International Press Corps made its way to Ocosingo, and we explained to them that they weren't allowing us to leave, and they said, well, when we leave, just follow us. They're not going to stop you, and that's what we did. But you know, being 23, young and naive, as I was leaving Mexico City, I actually was pulled back into the back room of the Mexico airport. And in retrospect, I'm pretty sure I was interviewed by a CIA person on the telephone. which a couple days later, the Venezuelan I was with was arrested because they thought he was Subcomandante Marcos, who was the voice of this whole rebellion, which I carried with me with much guilt for a long while. In any case, the Zapatistas movement was a movement of 4 different indigenous groups that was really trying to take back some land that they had lost, to convince the Mexican government that you know, basic resources of electricity and healthcare and education were human rights that they should also enjoy. Nonetheless, I returned to Utah and got back, and my mother said, but why don't you just study trees? They don't move. And it's true, they don't move. And I think she thought I would end up doing something in Utah, but at that point in my life, I wasn't really very attracted to the desert, even though I was living in the desert. I really wanted to be in the tropics with those muddy boots. So I moved on to another project, a very different project that my advisors suggested. And I'll just summarize it. There had been a recent paper published on something called tropical monodominant forests. And this sounds like an oxymoron because we all know that tropical forests are known for their diversity. So in a couple of acres, square acres, you might have 160 different plant species. But yet there are these areas of the world which at that time were really understudied, huge swaths of forest where there was just one species that dominated the canopy. And this just is not supposed to happen without some kind of human intervention, but it was natural. And their paper was hypothesizing that these forests were able to become kind of super competitors because they associated with a particular mycorrhizal fungi. And mycorrhizae are relationships between plant roots and fungi. And the fungal hyphae go out and bring in phosphorus and nitrogen, and the plant in return gives the fungal bodies of fungus carbon or sugars. So it's this mutualism that's very, very old. So the first place I went to try to study this was in the Darien of Panama, which had a forest, and Darien was a very quiet place in those days. It's much different now. I'm sure you're following the news. But we went off to the Darien and let me see. Traveled with my 2 advisors and this fellow Omar, who was a fellow graduate student who was Mexican, and we had wonderful guides take us around of both the Embera and the Wunan people. They were very generous in showing us their forests, explaining to us the knowledge they had of these forests, and these sort of put us up in their homes and showed us these gorgeous, gorgeous kapa forests. And this is a swamp species that spends half the year in a very inundated state and the other half of the year in a very dry state. And they are monodominant. I collected roots, and lo and behold, these had mycorrhizae, but not the specific ones that were supposed to turn it into a super competitor. So something else was going on in this forest, could have something to do with swamp tolerance, but it wasn't the right system to test that really interesting hypothesis that I'd read about in the paper. So that project ended there as well, but my advisors, they were so good at coming up with really remote places for me to go. They said, there's another place that we visited a few years ago when we were on sabbatical, and this one is in Zaire. And it's this incredibly beautiful forest, and it's monodominant, and we already know that it has the right kind of mycorrhizae because Bruno Fazzi, an Italian, had done research there in the 1950s, and so it was already well documented that this one had the right relationship. And my job was to go there and see whether or not the fungi had anything to do with it being this kind of super competitor, I kind of call it. Beautiful part of the world. I was in the Ituri rainforest, which is 24,000 square miles. It's actually kind of where that arrow stops here in northeastern, what was Zaire. Gorgeous, gorgeous rainforest. This is another shot of a pudu. This is the only place on Earth home to also the okapi, this crazy looking animal that's a relative of the giraffe, incredibly elusive mammal. They have these long blue tongues. They eat particular plants, and you just never see them in the forest. There happened to be a okapi breeding station in the little community where I was living, run by some folks from Switzerland. So that's okapi, and there were folks that would go out and harvest leaves for them and bring them to feed them, and they would breed these okapi and then send them and sell them to zoos around the world. Getting to this spot was incredibly difficult. I was there the first time in 1995. As you'll remember, this was the Belgian Congo. King Leopold owned this entire area for many, many years, probably some of the worst, most systemically brutal stories of humans destroying humans that I know of. If you're interested in this part of the world in history, I highly recommend Adam Hochschild's 1998 book called King Leopold's Ghost. It's a great treatment of what happened in the Congo. It's not an easy read. But when I arrived in 1995, Mobutu Sese Seko had been in power for over 30 years. He'd been put in place by the American CIA. It's a well-documented story. After they became independent, they had elected a socialist-leaning president. And at the time, the US was very wary of socialist-leaning anything, given our Cold War going on with USSR. And at this point, he was mostly living on the French Riviera and had not really spent a lot of time. We were very far away from Kisangani, the capital of the country, and the country really had fallen apart. I mean, this was the road. It took us, I think it took us, how many miles was it? I looked the other day. It took us 4 days to go 450 miles. It was extraordinary effort to get there. And in the end, our lovely, wonderful Land Rover, most amazing vehicle I've ever been in and seen move through mud, died for good. And we walked the last 20 kilometers. I just love this because these are driver ants. Which is a species of ants just moving across the soil. This is a botanist that I was working with, Teresa Hart, who was working for wildlife conservation at the time. And these are Mbuti people collecting leaves to take to those okapi in the breeding center. Mbuti people were called pygmies. If you hear the pygmy people, they're really called Mbuti. Truly one of the greatest experiences of my life. I got to work with the Mbuti people. This is a photo of me and Kenge. Kenge was in his 60s at this time, but he was the primary informant for Colin Turnbull's famous book called The Forest People that he had written back in the 50s and 60s, a Harvard anthropologist. We're trying to make some baskets where I could grow some seeds here. And I spent my days walking in the forest with Kenge, with Sengi. They would take me out foraging, taught me which mushrooms to collect. It's kind of cool. They collect mushrooms and then they make their own little parcel for carrying the mushrooms and then bring them back to the community and hand them off to the women to cook them. So everything I knew about the forest, I learned from Kenge. He really was my guide. He knew all the plant species. I would follow him every day and ask him to name everything for me. I know he got very frustrated with me because I could not learn them fast enough. They all kind of look the same in the tropics, but I also got to work with Bantu folks who are agriculturalists, as well as some Francophile botanists who are Zairawas, who were doing research on a big project as well. And we would go deeper into the forest, 20, 30 kilometers, and spend a week there working. This is deep in the forest and collecting data. One of the things, though, in addition to studying the roots of the plant, I was interested in other aspects of this forest, which were really different than the mixed species forest, which was just adjacent to it. And I wanted to measure the amount of light hitting the ground or the understory of the monodominant forest because it seemed very dark to me. I mean, all tropical forests, if you're walking in them, are very, very shady. But this one seemed particularly dark and I needed to measure it. But in order to measure the light, I needed to have a sense of how much light was up there above the trees and how much was coming down. And it just was really fortunate that the Mbuti people have a tradition of hunting for honey, and they're incredible tree climbers. This is a shot of a man going up with smoke, and he's going up to harvest honey, and they don't just harvest the honey, they take the larvae as well. So during the season when there's honey and there's this kind of hunting going on, everybody is just gorging themselves on honey and the larvae. So the larvae are just tons of great protein. The honey is just great calories, and everybody gets a little fat, and it's a really nice time of the year. I was able to benefit from that because Senge, who's the younger man here, he became the climber to move a light measurement, a light meter up above. He'd climb 30 meters up. He would stick it up there. The bamboo rod is broken, but it wasn't always broken. He would tie it up there. We had sensors on this understory. We'd leave the computer in the field for a week, and it would collect data, and then I'd go back, and then we'd move it to the other forest type, and we would go back and forth, and Sengi was constantly climbing up and down these trees to help me collect the data. Sorry, now I'm getting a set of myself. Yes, so I was there in 1995. I went back for a longer time in 1996. I made great friends. Had great hair done. Didn't work very well. It fell out really fast. But the plan for me was to return for all of 1997. But just as I was getting ready to leave in 1996, Mobutu Sese Seko died. And the moment he died, a civil war broke out in Eastern Congo. As you'll remember, the Rwandan genocide had happened in 93, 94. There were a lot of refugees living in the eastern part of Zaire, Democratic Republic of Congo. And we were literally from one moment to the next told, you've got to get out of here, and you've got to get out of here really fast. And so we went down the road to 70 kilometers to a Catholic mission. And the very nice priest, who also happened to be a pilot, put us in his plane, and on the grass runway took off, and we left. So I wasn't able to go back for the very long time that I was hoping to be there in 1997. This issues in Eastern DRC are ongoing today. There's a fabulous article written by Nicholas Kristof about what's happening in Eastern Congo and what's been going on there for the last 30 years. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but he's coming to the Summer Institute next summer. Wow. So, the fortunate piece is I have enough data between the work I'd done in Panama, a little bit of work I did in Trinidad and Tobago, and then the work I had done in the DRC. I had enough to complete my dissertation, which also ultimately proposed a new paradigm for thinking about these tropical monodominance forests. And I got to publish these papers, and like I said, I had this experience working there, but I also became really bothered by some of the experiences that I was very complicit in myself. Here I was hiring Sengi to climb a tree. The Mbuti don't use any ropes. They're expert climbers, but yet, you know, it was still a kind of transactional relationship where I was hiring somebody to do something quite dangerous, and I had lots of complicated feelings about the nature of us being from the Northern Hemisphere, Americans or Europeans, zooming into Africa, zooming into Central and South America, collecting our data and going home and using these data for our own good, for our own worldview of Western science. That Okapi breeding station to me was also very problematic. They were the Swiss folks, and they literally flew in their own butter from Switzerland to eat while they were in the DRC, but paid the local Mbuti people very, very little money to collect these plants that they needed to have for their animals. And like I said, I reflected that I really wasn't that much better. While I was there, I was very critical of the Swiss, but then when I thought about it, when I was back home, I was like, well, you also, Sylvia, you had a great relationship with the people you worked with, but would they have really been doing all that with you? Would they have wanted to spend every day in the forest with you if you weren't paying them? And did you pay them enough? And all of these questions, I ended up writing a series of essays about the relationship of me doing research in the tropics. Some of those have been published, some of those have never been published. But nonetheless, that started really deeply influencing my sense of what it is we're doing when we're doing biology or ecology or science in another country with indigenous folks. And I'm happy to talk more about that and where that field has evolved since the time I was doing my PhD research 30 years ago. But I realized at this time in finishing my dissertation that as much as I love science, there was so much more to the world, and it was going to be too restricting for me just to build a career around doing ecology, doing science. And I also hadn't really processed my own experience of being in Chiapas. My father was from Argentina. I grew up thinking I knew a whole lot about Latin America, and I realized, having been in Mexico during those 5 days that I was there, that I knew absolutely nothing about Mexico, the country closest to us. So I set out to study what was going on, and I studied Mexican history for a number of years after I finished my PhD. I studied the cultures. These are two of the main groups that were involved in the Zapatista uprising. I studied the forest group in the Lacandon rainforest, which really wasn't that involved. But the more and more I studied about Mexico and this part of the world that I knew nothing about, the more interesting it got. Of course, when we study something, it always gets more interesting. And then I wrote a short story one day. I don't know why I did that, but I remembered as I was leaving Chiapas, we were getting out. Someone had cut a tree in front of the road, and we had to move the tree in order to get our cars out. And I could see folks watching us, probably the people who cut the tree, maybe. And I ended up writing a short story from the perspective that I imagined of this woman who was watching us try to move this tree out, and from her perspective. And it was a short story that got published in a local paper in Utah, and I won a contest. And from then on, I went to conferences, and I started to think about the craft of writing, basically I fell in love again with writing. And one story turned into two stories from a different perspective. And then after that, with more encouragement from folks that I was interacting with who were writers, I ended up creating a whole novel based on 4 characters, which is the one that you've referenced, The Scorpion's Tale, which is a kind of coming-of-age story of 4 characters. It starts about 6 months before the Zapatista uprising. 3 of the 4 characters are Mexican. One of the characters is a naive American entomologist, who, I will just say, this is the humbling moment, is I based her on the annoying American entomologist I was with in Chiapas, who thought the military's arrival would be a really great thing for all of us, and the Mexicans too. In retrospect, I was much more that woman than I ever thought myself, and so it's an interesting way that when we're writing fiction, sometimes we're othering our own self, and it's only later, after you finish a work, that you realize that you are all of those characters, of course, and you have actually revealed your own arrogance or your own naivete or your own ignorance in the process of writing another human being into existence. And as time went on, I continued writing short stories and some essays, and I became just more and more curious about how science and the humanities and the arts could probe one another. This idea that if we brought science and the humanities and the arts together, could we deepen our understanding about important questions? I mean, we can study the natural world through science, and it's powerful and it's rewarding, but science by definition seeks to be objective. It seeks to exclude the subjective eye. And there are some limitations imposed by that method to understanding the interaction between humans and other living things. I was also really interested in the power of the arts and the humanities to reveal more about our relationships with one another and what's often called the more than human world. And I realized that I personally felt most alive when I was working at the ecotones of these disciplines, which inspired me to then embed myself in a laboratory that was studying birdsong. And I used that experience to explore communication between humans and between humans and other species. And that resulted in my second novel, Cages. And this novel questions what can and cannot be said. It explores the ethical issues related to animal research and communication in general. And it was a really funny lab to be embedded in. I originally thought I might do some research and realized I didn't like doing surgeries on birds, which is what they were doing to some degree. But the principal investigator and the other folks studying there, they had this motto: we study communication because we're no good at it. And after a few months of me being there, I said, you're right, you're really no good at it. And so it was funny, they allowed me to stay in their lab for a couple of years. I consider them my collaborators, but that was resulted as trying to understand animal to animal communication, and then animal to human communication, and human to human communication. And so this is really how I've organized my life ever since. I have used my training, my experience as a scientist as the foundation, along with the power of fiction, to try to reveal more information about the relationships we have with one another and with the rest of the beings on this planet. It's extraordinary to think that we are one species on a planet with 10 million, 100 million. We don't even know how many species are on this planet, and we're just one species. And each piece of writing that I do, I'm constantly asking myself questions about how these relationships are reflected in power structures, the agency of the players, the ethics of our choices. And so all of my writing, the short stories, the novels, the essays, engage ecology and the capacities and the failings of the human spirit. And all of my background, I think, my studying science, ecology in particular, the international experiences I've had, the exploration of fiction and writing, all made it possible for me to be ready to join this community at College of the Atlantic and to lead a school that's doing exactly what I think we all should be doing, is having this framework of the human ecological approach in the ways that we try to understand this incredibly complex world we live in, as well as our own internal complexities as individuals, and as one species on this wondrous planet. I think I will stop there and take questions and go any direction that folks are wanting to go, whether it's more into the science or more into the writing. But that is the journey that brought me here, and thank you so much.
Good questions.
Thank you. My question, I guess, fundamentally is, where do you think we're headed as a species? Contact in many different places. I had sort of the inverse of your experience. In other words, I grew up here on the island. I wanted to be a biologist. I wanted to go to Woods Hole. I had a wonderful mentor in college, and we were headed in that direction. And then I applied to medical school and got in. And when I reported to him, he said, "What the hell did you do that for?" And so I kind of wondered why I did do that in a way. I mean, it was a marvelous career in human medicine. But Cookie told me a story this week, and I think it's factual. It came from Alaska. There was a drone or something up looking around in the landscape, and they thought they saw this dark figure down in the snow. And it turned out to be a ranger, an Alaskan ranger who had gotten stranded. They landed, and he was surrounded by two wolves who were keeping him warm. He survived, so he could tell the story as it unfolded. And, so what's going on there? Anyway, so where are we headed?
Well, the short answer to that is we are headed to extinction, and that is only because every single species that's ever really been on planet Earth, has gone extinct. 99% of the species that have ever existed are now extinct, I should say. So the long-term trajectory for any species is extinction. That's just how it goes. But in the short term, in our lifespan, in the coming thousands of years, I do not think the human species is going to go extinct. So where are we headed in terms of, maybe you're asking our relationship with the more than human world, and in terms of that's just such an easy question, Bill. I should ask Dr. Katona to answer this question. I think that the one thing is humans are incredibly resilient, as is every living thing on this planet. And so I think our relationships will just continue to evolve. I mean, the challenge for us as we live is this baseline. Like my baseline for what felt like nature when I was 15 is a very different baseline than my son has experienced growing up. And it's very different than a child born today. And so we can be nostalgic about what or what isn't, but fundamentally the relationships between living and non-living, those relationships are fruitful and ongoing and dynamic. And I find beauty in that. So I find a lot of joy and positivity, even in a world that is not what I wish it were, in terms of certainly we're losing species. Certainly it's completely a catastrophe in many ways. But I also have this optimism about humans and other species and their ways of interacting with one another. The other way to think about it is, we are the most successful invasive species on planet Earth. We very quickly, after becoming Homo sapiens, traveled everywhere. And everywhere we went, we have enormous impact on every other living being there. We are just a super species in any way you want to put the word super. But I'm not negative about it.
Well, good.
Let's see, this isn't working. Hello, testing. Do you have any book projects going on right now?
Well, no, because I have a day job that's a night job too. I do have a project that I'm interested in working on eventually. So I am able to write shorter things, here and there. But I have a project that's 3 connected novellas based on my Argentine heritage. And the first novella is about my father, but I'm using whatever I want from his life. And then I make up stuff whenever it serves the story. And then the second story is kind of going to be based on me, and I'm turning myself into a whale biologist because I'm really used to take students to Patagonia to see the southern right whales. And I have an affinity with Argentina, but was not born there. So there's that character. And then the third character will be based loosely on my son, who was born in Argentina, who I really tried to turn into an Argentine. And he just doesn't have that much interest, except he does like his Argentine passport. So it's a kind of a story of playing around about legacy heritage, how one generation pushes against the last generation. I'm going to have to wait to finish that for a few years, I think. Yes.
I have a question. Given your understanding and your experience with the power of stories, why do you think the science community and the environmentalists have failed so miserably at telling the story of climate change? That we just don't seem to have a powerful narrative that isn't washed away by the naysayers.
That's a great question. So the question for those online is why, given the power of story that story has, why haven't ecologists, conservationists, folks thinking about climate been able to create effective stories that really change how we interact with the world and through policy? I remember some years ago, a number of ecologists sitting around saying, we've done a terrible job of this. The molecular and cellular biologists have done much better because they connect everything to human health and trying to delay or postpone or the inevitable mortality of humans. And so they've been able to sell their research in a way to NIH and to NSF and to the federal, the policymakers in a way that we as ecologists are always telling the doom and gloom story. Things are getting bad, we're losing species. But I also think there's a bigger piece to it. And it's, when you're thinking about health research, something that, you're looking at reductionist things, you can control them very well in the laboratory. You can find quick answers to things, relatively speaking. When you're studying ecology, something as big as that, we're talking about years, decades, centuries. We're talking about complexity that's very hard to distill into a story that will directly benefit humans, right? We're all now living with things that were put into play, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, right? People knew that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was going to increase and that it was going to have impacts. But yet making those direct connections, I think, is very hard. But there may be something between the positive and the negative. You know, the amount of money that goes into healthcare research is just, it outshadows the ecology research. Maybe we are so arrogant still as humans that we think it won't matter if we lose a certain number of species on Earth. Maybe we think we can engineer our way through the world. There's a great book that I will highly recommend called oh boy, Sylvia, I'll get to it. Sorry. Let's go to another question. I'll get to it because it sort of answers that. Yes, Steve.
I have a question. So traditionally, the narrative has been that evolution works by competition, and the unit of selection is the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, the role of symbiosis and mutualism has been highlighted, and I think that came really to fruition in Suzanne Simard's book, The Mother Tree, and all that. And then, of course, in Richard Powers' The Overstory,
Mm-hmm.
which I love both.
Great.
And so, but then there was a big backlash against Susan Simard's interpretation that of the dominance of mutualism, and I haven't followed where that controversy has gone, but I'm just wondering, what's your take on the relative balance between mutualism and individualism, both in the natural world and also in the human part?
I thought Bill's question was hard.
Well,
So Dr. Katona here, Steve Katona is asking about, for folks online, the predominant idea of evolution happened through competition and forces of natural selection acted on the individuals. And yet in the last number of years, there's been a lot of work around mutualism and the importance of mutualistic relationships and selection actually acting on maintaining and strengthening those mutual relationships for the good of each individual part of that relationship. So there's mycorrhizae I was just talking about. And there's a book about the way trees are connected in the soil to one another and how they're transmitting information through the hyphae of fungi many times or through the air molecules. And then Richard Powers, a fabulous story, the Overstory about trees and the history of trees and everything else that I can't believe an author could get so much into a book. So the question is, where do I feel like the balance is? The short answer is I haven't followed the literature in that. I don't read primary literature on a daily basis, so I don't know where the folks in the field would come down on that. My take on it is that we are just scratching the surface at this point on mutualisms and on microbiomes and on the things that are tiny that we can't see and the influence of those things on system level processes. And so the backlash to Simard, maybe she anthropomorphizes a little bit and people don't like that in the science community, but I think that that group of folks is really onto something new. I mean, yes, competition is a force, it's a process, but this idea of microorganisms and symbiotic relationships is something that until recently we haven't actually been able to study it. Thank goodness for the molecular tools we have now, for the genetic tools we have now. We couldn't see these things in the past, and now we can see them in ways and do tests on them. So I think more will come out about the relationships and how it isn't just individualistic selection. That's my thought.
yeah, I agree. Also, I think it may be good to believe it, even if it's not true.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, and then your question about, us as humans, like, I don't know, are we even individuals? We are so made up of so many organisms, and there's all that research going on about what's actually controlling our decision making and influencing us. But we all are completely connected to one another. I mean, I don't know of any human who really, maybe there's one or two people who live off and don't connect to other people, but human beings are social animals. We do not exist without social relationships and social connections. And so the mutualistic ways that we connect to one another have made us. That's probably why we're the big successful invasive species on planet Earth, is our incredible capacity to come together and be more than an individual. For good, for bad, I think it's for good. Well, it can be for good. Yes.
Sylvia, we wish you a long and happy career at COA. But as that winds down, what do you think for yourself as ambition, goals, as you continue to kind of synthesize your science, your writing, et cetera?
Gosh, I just started at COA. Well, I would like to write this other book that I have that's been swirling around, and it takes me quite a while to write. So, I need to be doing nothing else. Both of my novels, I wrote the vast majority of them in very short periods of time, but when I was at writing residencies where I literally didn't talk to anyone else, and I ate tuna out of a can, and it was very, very intense. And then I edit for years and years and years. But I imagine wanting to have a period of time where I can generate those 3 novellas. What else? The other things that I've been thinking about recently that I really enjoy is, sharing my story of, my career path, how in mentoring younger people and how they need to think about their lives, because that's not something I, benefited from when I was going, through my education. In fact, my PhD advisor, Tom, said, well, what do you mean you're not going to go do a postdoc? What are you going to do with your life? And I said, well, I don't know. He goes, are you going to go and have a job where you go at 8 a.m. and go home at 6? And I said, I don't know, Tom, but you get here at 5:30 a.m. and go home at 7 every single day. So I don't know but they couldn't help me think about, and I think that I love to talk to younger people about, how their passions can be put together in creative ways, and how you live it forward and you talk about your career backwards. So I can imagine doing more work in that space with students. I'm pretty far away from science. I don't conduct science anymore. I like to read it. I really love to teach basic ecology. I'd love to get out in the field with students because I like that. It's fun. But sort of higher level science, I don't think I'll ever go back to that in any serious way. Maybe I'll go become a nurse or go to med school.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.